Hi, and welcome back. Well, it's week 5. Spring is here. The birds are singing outside, as you will probably hear on the recording. I apologize, I'm a little bit late this week in preparing this introductory lecture. I've had a few other things to do, but here we are, and the topic that we're going to be considering is genetics and social stratification. Enjoy. This week, we're exploring some of the literature on the connection between genetic variation and social stratification. It's difficult to think of a subject in the social sciences that is more likely to be a source of polarizing controversy and dogmatism. For some, even the broaching of the subject is tantamount to an endorsement of the worst crimes of the 20th century. For others, academic freedom to investigate genetic hypotheses has become a symbolic battle in a highly politicized culture war. I hope in our discussion we're able to avoid these extremes. However, it is a fact of life that whatever view one takes, even if one professes no view at all, there will be someone somewhere who doesn't like it and is ready to accuse you of being either a thin end of the wedge eugenicist or a woke social justice warrior. Given the context, it seems reasonable for me to make the rather unusual move of beginning by being explicit about my point of view. It won't take very long, because it isn't very deep or complicated. It's completely uncontroversial to acknowledge that human genetic variation affects many human traits: height, weight, eye color, skin tone, some forms of mental disability, some forms of psychiatric disorder. Whether genetic variation affects other traits, intelligence, propensity to take risks, speed at processing complex information, educational success, socioeconomic status, this is an entirely empirical question about which there's no need to take an a priori view. Moreover, even if we find irrefragable evidence that variation in such traits is linked to genetic variation, we are still, as with any scientific question, left with the opportunity to say, so what? What follows from that? The answers to those questions will be decided by political, not scientific deliberation. Genetic variation is not destiny, either at the individual or the population level. If it were, myopia, which has both genetic and environmental causes, would, in our modern world, be a major problem for those that suffer from it, rather than an easily corrected minor irritant. So my invitation to you is to be open-minded, which of course does not imply being empty-minded. Social stratification is about variation. People get different test scores, different grades in school, earn different amounts of money, and die at different ages. These are differences we tend to care about. If we can, we'd like to explain them. Who gets ahead and why is something that social scientists have been curious about for a very long time. The first part of the standard strategy of investigation is to establish how much variation, in say earnings, is shared with variation in the things that you think are likely to be responsible for variation in earnings. For example, the amount or the type of education that someone has had. Of course, as everyone knows, this is only the starting point, and we're still a long way from establishing a causal connection. All human beings are cut from the same genetic cloth. We're all more similar to each other than our nearest species neighbours. But it is, amongst other things, the genetic differences between us that make us the individuals we are. And because we reproduce sexually, each generation's genetic cards are shuffled. Speaking rather informally, we share on average 50% of our genes with our parents and 50% with our siblings. Dizygotic twins are the same as ordinary siblings. Monozygotic twins share 100% of the genetic makeup, though are not necessarily literally identical at birth because of intrauterine differences in environment. Say we want to estimate the heritability of a human trait, such as cognitive ability. One way we can do this is to administer tests to samples of monozygotic and dizygotic twins, and then calculate the correlations between the test scores of the twin pairs. If you're able to do this, and are happy that a number of other assumptions are satisfied, then twice the difference between the monozygotic and the dizygotic correlations is an indirect estimate of the additive heritability of cognitive ability. There are, of course, lots of caveats, ifs and buts that normally hedge a statement like that, some of which are discussed in the assigned reading, but as a first approximation, that statement will do. It's important to realize that heritability is a property of a population, not of an individual. It describes the proportion of the variation in the trait, in this case cognitive ability, that is shared with the genetic differences between the individuals in the population. It's an indirect estimate because we haven't actually directly observed and measured those genetic differences. A more direct approach is to use gene sequencing of genetic samples from human populations to construct direct measures of genetic variation in so-called GWAS, or genome-wide association studies. Such variation can then be used to predict variability in whatever traits one is interested in. That makes it sound simple and straightforward. It isn't. It really isn't. And again, some of the details of this are discussed in your assigned reading. The big question lurking in the background is how much of the variability that we observe in things like intelligence, schooling, and earnings are linked to genetic variation, and how much to environmental variation. From the moment of conception, we have a genetic identity that makes us different from everyone else, unless of course we're a monozygotic twin. But as soon as we start to develop in the womb, the environment begins to influence us. That environment can be impoverished and bleak, or it can be nurturing and full of the resources that will enable us to have a fulfilling life. Just as there is genetic variation, there is environmental variation. Some get the cream, and some get the shitty end of the stick. We care about the environmental variation because while we can't change our genes, we can change our environment. Poor people can be given money. Deprived kids can be given compensatory education. The rich can be taxed. We can remove lead from the atmosphere. A standard question to ask is how much of the phenotypic variation we observe can be attributed to genetics and how much to the environment. This turns out to be a question that is not straightforward to answer. Consider a family: mother, father, and 2 children. To simplify things, let's assume that the children are same-sex fraternal twins. The children, therefore, share 50% of their genes. They also share an environment, the family home, the resources their parents provide, their neighbourhood, possibly friends, probably a school. Part of their environment is shared. Whatever effect it has is going to be an effect on both of the children. But part of the environment is unique to each of the children. You know, stuff happens. A friend falls out with one twin, but not the other. One breaks their leg and misses some weeks' schooling, the other makes the football team. For each individual, the unique environmental events are important. One way of looking at this is to say that there are systematic environmental effects on both twins, and there are chance events which affect one or the other in idiosyncratic ways. But things are excuse me. But things are even more complicated. We've talked about all this as though we can just simply add a portion of variation attributable to genetics to a portion of variation attributable to shared environment and a portion of variation attributable to unique environment, and work out which of the portions is the largest, and then draw a conclusion about the relative influence of nature and nurture. But it doesn't work quite like that. Firstly, there may be gene-environment interactions. In some environments, genetic variation may have a big influence on trait variation, while in others, none at all. Say, for instance, that the population is split hypothetically into two groups, slaves and the free. Slaves are not permitted to go to school, but the free can obtain as much schooling as their ability allows. Genetic variability can influence the attainment of education among the free, but can have no influence among the slaves whatsoever, because none of them get any education at all. Or consider the possibility that people with certain genetic propensities choose the environments they expose themselves to. Those with a genetically influenced taste for risk seek out more risky environments. Of course, the consequences of this can themselves vary radically depending on the environments that are sought out. Middle-class kids with a taste for risk may end up in the city, whereas genetically similar kids born in the ghetto may end up incarcerated. For a long time, sociology has either ignored genetic variation in the populations it studies, or has simply declared such variation irrelevant to its concerns. It seems clear that these positions are no longer intellectually tenable. We may think we dislike what we imagine some of the implications of this to be, but to evaluate them and inoculate ourselves against the worst of the hype that inevitably follows in the trail of an exciting new field, we need to understand the growing avalanche of work that seeks to make a connection between genetics and stratification.